Welcome to the Courage Over Cowardice podcast, where I cover topics and issues that will help you take a stand for Christ in culture. More than ever, followers of Jesus need courage to stand up, speak up, and to live out their faith, because people need to know that there's a God in heaven that loves them, and it is His truth that sets people free. Thanks for listening today, and I hope that you enjoyed the episode. I want to welcome you to the Courage Over Cowardice podcast. It is my privilege to have back again on the podcast. It's been over a year now. The Dr. Frank Turek, brilliant Christian apologist, which I have great respect for. And he has a ministry called Cross-Examine. I'd encourage you to check it out. Wonderful resources that we utilize in my family, and I encourage others to use. Dr. Franks, thanks so much for being back on the podcast today.
I'm afraid to be here, Sam, on this Courage podcast, so you're going to have to hold my hand through it.
Well, I wanted to talk specifically for a few minutes today around this issue of politics and voting. We're in an election year, and we're just coming off the heels of an assassination attempt with President Trump. And we know that there's calls for civility and unity, which we would agree with calls for civility. We can't unify around everything. But I want to just open it up. I'll give your take, your perspective on that. And then I have a number of questions I'd like to ask you in relation to how Christians should vote. What is the process they should engage with? Because it's important for today, but it's important for the rest of our lives, because there are going to be lots of candidates. It's going to be evolving platforms. So we want to deal with the now and not yet. But just your take on the current state, what happened, and anything you would like to share about that.
Yeah, well, it's a big issue, Christians in politics. And whenever somebody says that we ought not be involved politically, I always ask them why. Why do you think that's the case? And people will come up with all sorts of inane excuses. Well, separation of church and state, or you ought not impose your morality on other people. And when they say that, I just say to them, have you really looked into those issues? Because they don't prevent Christians from being involved in politics. Like the separation of church and state. Let's just start there. We don't have to go through all the details to point out why that is not in the Constitution. But even if it was, it has nothing to do with Christians being engaged in voting for people or being in government themselves. We're not trying to establish a national church. We're not trying to tell people where, when, how, or if to worship. That would be establishing a national church. But we are trying to tell people how they ought to treat one another, and that's legislating morality, and all laws legislate morality. Every law declares one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. Even people on the left are trying to impose a moral point of view. For example, take the abortion issue, right? It is true that conservatives are trying to impose continued pregnancy on the mother. However, pro-abortion people are trying to impose death on the baby whenever abortion is chosen. Both of those are moral positions. The only question is, what's the right moral position? And when you have a conflict between liberty and life, liberty always must give way to life, because the right to life is the right to all other rights. If you don't have life, you don't have anything. So obviously a woman has a right to control her own body, but not if she murders somebody else in the process. So both are trying to impose morality. The only question is whose morality will be imposed. And I don't want to impose my morality, Sam. I don't want to impose your morality. I want to impose the morality. The morality Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The morality the Apostle Paul said, the Gentiles are not of the law written on their hearts. In other words, you don't even need the Bible to know this. You know it's wrong to murder innocent people. That's the morality we need to impose. We're not imposing religion. We're not telling people where, when, how, or if to worship, but we are imposing morality, and that's what everybody does.
Yeah, that's well said. That's a great point. And as we think about politics, generally a couple different things happen as far as people responding. Say, "Well, I don't get into politics. I don't do politics," which I would say, there's a lot of people love the verse, "Love your neighbor," and if you're going to love your neighbor fully, you should be engaged in their flourishing and well-being as best you can. And we're in this unique experiment in our country where we have an opportunity to vote and to help put laws into place to be a blessing to our neighbor. And so you have people that fall into the other camp where, politics is everything, the ideology of the day, and it becomes a form of worship. And a lot of people kind of end up in the middle. But I think there's confusion in talking with Christians. And there's a lot of beliefs out there. We know that there's a handful of percentage of people in our country that have a Christian worldview, or at least an adequate Christian worldview that aligns with Scripture. So what we used to say is just, hey, vote biblical values, which is problematic when even the Christians don't have biblical values, but I still think it is important. It's an important thing to say. And so I wanted to kind of unwrap and give some very, kind of a grid or a guideline, some thoughts, some wisdom from you on, my perspective is we live in Babylon. We live in a secular culture that's trying to be increasingly godless, yet we have this incredible opportunity to be salt and light. And there seems to be confusion with Christians that, especially in our progressivism that's happening within the church, to always leer to the left under various sayings, love your neighbor, or there's more to it than just one issue. And sometimes I feel like people don't have a good framework with how they should vote. So in preparing this, and I want to throw out a couple questions, I went to ChatGPT, which is always trustworthy. And I just put in, I'm doing a podcast with Dr. Frank Turek. What are questions that that would be good to ask him, and what are things that he says in regarding to voting? So we'll see how well we align the podcast with what ChatGPT came up with. But I wanted to kick it off and just as we talk about the grid of how we should vote. The first thing that kind of came up, and I already had this written down, was biblical values. So why don't we start there? Just as Christians, when we think about voting, there's lots of ideas that come up. What are some things that we should be considerate of as believers as we head to the poll booth this fall?
We can take a lesson from Jesus, and it's an easy verse to remember. It's Matthew 23:23. People will say Jesus didn't get involved in politics, which is complete nonsense. Who are the people he went up against the most? The Pharisees. Who were the Pharisees? The Pharisees were the religious and political leaders of Israel. Some of them are on the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, to whom Rome delegated day-to-day lawmaking authority to. In other words, the Pharisees were the politicians, and Jesus scolded them for what they did. In Matthew 23:23, let me quote it directly because Jesus was not always a nice guy. People think, oh yeah, Jesus was a really nice guy. No, he wasn't. Here's what he says to the Pharisees. Again, Matthew 23:23. He says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former, you blind guides. You strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. All right, what's he saying? He's saying you're tithing your spices, which you should do, these minor issues, but you're neglecting the more important matters of the law. In other words, there's a hierarchy of laws that are important. You can't just adhere to the minor issues. You've got to spend your time on the major issues before you get to the minor issues. And Sam, we could be excoriated by Jesus in this culture right now for the same reason. The current administration, the Biden administration, is majoring in the minors. They're telling us what light bulbs we can and can't use. They're telling us what cars we can and can't drive. They're telling us what foods we can and can't eat. But they won't say, don't murder your children. In fact, they'll encourage us to murder our children. They'll pay for our abortions. They won't say, don't mutilate your children. In fact, they've warned that they're going to come to our homes and take our kids away from us if we don't agree that with this so-called gender affirming care, which is not care at all. It's mutilating a child. So we are neglecting the more important matters of the law. So when you go into the voting booth, you have to vote according to the more important matters of the law, not merely the minor points of the law. And as we progress, maybe we can go through some of those. What are the more important matters of the law?
Yeah, so that's a great point. Well said. In setting up, Christian involvement beginning with Jesus and the engagement of culture. And oftentimes we see it as, hey, we're just called to love people. We don't focus on any disagreements. It's this idea.
Hey, can we stop right there for just a second? What you just said. We're called to love people. That's something we need to clear up. What does love mean? Does love mean approval? Every parent knows it doesn't. Like if you're a parent and you approve of everything your 13-year-old wants to do, are you loving? No, you're unloving. No. You got to stand in the way of evil if you're going to love that kid. Love means seeking what's best for the other person, and you don't just approve of everything someone else wants to do. That's not loving. By the way, in the passage that on love that everybody reads at their wedding, but nobody obeys, 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, love always protects. Love does not rejoice in wrongdoing. Love rejoices in the truth. Love always perseveres. So how do you love people? You protect them. You don't approve of everything they want to do. You persevere with them. You don't rejoice in wrongdoing. Yet people in our culture think, particularly on the sexual issues, oh, if you want to love me, you have to approve of what I want to do sexually. No, I don't. That's not love. That's enablement. Yeah. I'm not loving you. It was Thomas Sowell who famously said, when you want to help people, you tell them what they need to hear. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. And you know what we do? We tell people what they want to hear. Why? Because we're trying to help ourselves. We don't want them mad at us. Well, Jesus gave us one new command, love one another as I have loved you. How did he love us? He sacrificed himself for us. We need to do the same for people. That means we should sacrifice our comfort to help them. It doesn't mean we tell them what they want to hear so we're comfortable and they don't get mad at us. No, we should sacrifice ourselves to try and help them. That's what love is. It doesn't mean approval. Yeah,
that's so good. So well said. And within that, when we think about our opportunity to vote, there's, in my opinion, I feel like there's a greater concern in relation to our tone than to truth within the context of the church.
We should have both.
And
but yes,
correct.
Yes, yeah.
But if we're going to err on the side, it's everything is about tone, which is rather subjective, because a serial killer can smile and do his work and have the right tone, but it'd be very evil. And I think for us, when we're looking at this government, speak to the persons like that says, "Hey, both sides are bad. We're in the world. We're not of the world. We're kingdom-minded. It'll always be this way. There's good and there's bad. Whatever's in your heart, you just, whatever's important to you, you just vote according to that." So just begin to speak to that in relation to the hierarchical issues and a biblical approach.
Well, first of all, following your heart is not the right prescription. And even Trump and his new VP have said, follow your heart on the abortion issue. That's bad advice. Okay.
Yes.
Why? Because our hearts are corrupt. Our heart wants what it wants and when it wants it. If you follow your heart, you're not going to wind up in a good place. You're going to wind up in a dark place because your heart is selfish. Your heart is deceitful. Your heart wants what it wants when it wants it. And if you follow your heart without moral restraint, it's not going to turn out well for you or other people. You need to follow the truth and not just give in to every whim and impulse that you have. So let me say that right off the bat. Now, thankfully, Trump and Vance, the new VP, are pro-life generally. And maybe we can talk about their watering down of the amendment. We can get to that a little bit later. But the other side is so far to the left that they now want the government to pay for abortions all the way up to the moment of birth and maybe even after birth. So to say that I'm just going to follow my heart in the voting booth is not good advice. It's not good advice almost at any time to follow your heart without moral restraint. So that's a bad way of going about things. So right off the bat, follow your heart is not the solution. In fact, I have a whole presentation where I talk about there's 3 reasons you can't follow your heart without moral restraint. And there's 3 C's. Your heart is corrupt, Your heart is conflicting and your heart is changing. Your heart is changing all the time. And so even if you wanted to follow your heart, you couldn't, because tomorrow you're going to wake up and want something else, right? And a lot of times your heart's conflicting. You want two things at the same time. You can't have both, right? Which, like, for example, when you get married, right? I mean, on one hand, you want to get married and settle down and have kids. On the other hand, you still want to play the field. You can't follow both hearts. I don't know about you, Sam. Well, I do know about you, Sam, but I know a lot of guys, for me anyway, when I got married, it put a big damper on my dating life, right? I just couldn't, continue to play the field, right? You couldn't either. So you can't follow both hearts. So this idea to follow your heart, I know it's the mantra of our day. It's poison. It's actually going to hurt people. You've got to follow the truth. And that's what we can talk about as we get into these issues. What is the truth on these issues? What are the major issues? What are the minor issues? And what should you do?
Yeah. So let's jump in there. It's often said from the social justice perspective, which we differentiate from biblical justice, which is very important. You're just, right-wing people, you're just about babies in the womb, but we're about to the tomb. We're about the totality of man and humanity. And, there's lots of issues, not just one. So I guess let's start there and talk about the big one, abortion, and then go to the other, as you would see them, and I would agree, hierarchical issues.
Well, first of all, let's point out there is a hierarchy biblically and from a common sense perspective, right? It's worse to murder somebody than to jaywalk. We all know that, okay? Right. Okay. So Jesus, and we can't go through all the references here, but Jesus talks about the greatest commandment, greater love, greater sin, greater judgment, greater knowledge will bring greater punishment. And as we mentioned in Matthew 23:23, he talks about the more important matters of the law. I could give you scripture references for all that, but we don't have time for that. Okay. The point here is that there are more important matters than other matters. Now, when it comes to life obviously is the most important issue. Why? Because the right to life is the right to all other rights. If you don't have life, you don't have anything. Yeah. If you want to murder people, sorry, I'm not going to be for you. And at this point, people will say, well, wait a minute, Frank, are you a one-issue voter? And my response is, no, I'm not a one-issue voter. I'm a one-issue disqualifier. In other words, I want my candidate to be good on not just the life issue, but if he's not good on the life issue or she's not good on the life issue, they've disqualified themselves, because that's the most important issue. If you don't get that right, I don't trust you on anything else. And life is the most important issue. So if you're not pro-life, you're disqualified. You can be pro-life and awful on other issues. That doesn't make you a good candidate. But a minimum requirement for a candidate ought to be that they're pro-life. Now, this issue about, we're pro-life after birth. Well, so am I, okay? Yeah. But to say that because I don't agree with your social welfare programs after birth doesn't give you the right to murder children before birth. Yeah. I mean, I remember this happened many years ago. There was a debate. Frank Beckwith, who's a Catholic apologist, was debating some pro-abortion people, and his colleague was a Mormon gentleman. And the Mormons, of course, are pro-life. And at one point, the pro-abortion side said, hey, we're pro-life after birth. And if you Christians want to be pro-life, why don't you adopt all the babies that are going to be born as a result of you putting an anti-abortion law in place? And this Mormon guy said, I have 3 young children at home right now as we speak. He said, if I go home, or I think he put it this way, he said, if I don't want those kids, can I murder them tonight if you don't agree to adopt them tomorrow? And they all went, no, right? Just because I can't adopt all the children doesn't mean that you're justified in murdering your children. Yeah. That's a non sequitur, okay? Those are two different issues. And let me point out one other thing. There's a difference between an essential issue and an ends and means issue. An essential issue is we ought to have laws against murder. Okay. There's no other way to protect innocent people than to have laws against murder. An ends and means issue is there may be different ways to get to the same end. Like, for example, I think both generally Republicans and Democrats want to help the poor. I'll say they both do. Okay. That's an end they both share, but they may disagree on the means on how to get there. Democrats tend to say we have to have more government handouts, while Republicans say, no, that just breeds dependency. We have to have a minimum safety net, but we want to encourage more economic growth because a rising tide lifts all boats. We want to give them more opportunities to succeed on their own. Both people want to help the poor. They just disagree on the means to do so. Mm-hmm. But because we may disagree over the means of these ends and means issues, doesn't mean that that's an equal issue to the life and death issue that abortion brings us.
Yeah.
So we all should agree that we ought not murder innocent people. We may disagree on how to help them after they're born.
Yeah.
But we ought to all agree we ought not murder them. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thou shalt not shed innocent blood, and murder the innocent is enshrined from the very beginning in our morality. It's written on our heart. It was written on those tablets thousands of years ago and passed down to this day. And I think anyone that's being intellectually honest, in our heart of hearts, they know. So let's pause from the next issue, and let's stay here with abortion for a moment. And let me ask you about this, kind of a two-part answer into this question. So you had mentioned that we have currently Trump and J.D. Vance are the ticket for the Republicans. They are watering down, or the Republican Party is watering down the pro-life platform. My text streams have been lit up the last couple of days with a lot of very unhappy people, and I agree with that. Some would say, well, they watered it down, so that means there's no difference now. So why should I even bother? I should just vote for whoever I want. So answer that from your perspective, and within that context, kind of a two-part. Others would say, you know what? There's no perfect candidates. You know, how could I vote for, Trump or whomever, because he did X, Y, Z as a businessman. He's a felon. But this guy is, he's a wonderful grandfather. He just happens to, have a few bad laws. So I know I threw two things at you there, but take them and give us your thoughts.
Right. Well, first of all, Trump was the guy that got Roe v. Wade overturned. And the reason he got Roe v. Wade overturned is because he was a political novice, and he didn't have to dole out favors to people by appointing them to judgeships. So what did he do when the Supreme Court decisions came along? He called up the Federalist Society. He said, who should I appoint? And they told him, and he did. Okay. So he got Roe v. Wade overturned, which took abortion from a national issue to a state issue. So what Trump is saying now, hey, it's a state issue now. Let the states deal with it. Yeah, we're pro-life, and maybe we can come to a compromise where we're going to save some babies, but not all. All right. And so he was asked, well, if a federal amendment comes to your desk, would you sign it to ban all abortions? And he said, no. Okay. Well, most pro-lifers would say, well, why not? Well, first of all, if that ever did come to his desk, the country would be largely pro-life, because that's the only way it's going to get to his desk. A constitutional amendment takes like 3/5 of the 2/3 of the Congress and like 3/5 of the states or something to ratify. It takes like 37 states to. That's not going to happen in today's environment. So it's a question that is really irrelevant. Okay. He's not going to get a constitutional amendment through now. Now, maybe through persuasion, maybe if there's a spiritual revival, maybe if we can make enough progress with people to show them. And by the way, if you go to caseforlife.com and you watch a 1-minute video, I think you'll become pro-life immediately, because when you see this video, you'll see what abortion does. But maybe through a long period of convincing the American people the truth on this issue, we could get to that point. Right now, we can't. And he's right about that. We can't.
Yeah.
However, voting for the Republican platform, which we'll get to here in a minute, I think makes a lot more sense than the Democrat platform on abortion, because we are not going to get radical leftist judges who might bring another Roe v. Wade into our world if the Democrats win and put those kind of judges in place. And those are the kind of judges they want to put in. Would I prefer a stronger pro-life plank? Of course. But pragmatically, I know it's not going to happen now. We're going to need to work incrementally, just like God did in the Old Testament, by the way. Jesus in Matthew 19:8 says, look, you guys wanted divorce, and because of the hardness of your heart, Moses gave it to you, but was not this way from the beginning. In other words, God brought even Israel along incrementally, and that's what we're going to need to do on the abortion issue. So you're not going to get the same thing if you vote for the Republican platform as the Democrat platform. At least if you vote for the Republican platform, you are not going to get opposition to the pro-life position. You're certainly going to get opposition from the Democrats who want to pay for it. Yeah,
that's so true. So someone says, you know what, they're both they're flawed candidates. You just need to, from a personal standpoint, people say, it's hard for me to vote for, President Trump, fill in the blank, in the future, because he said these things, he did these things, even though I might agree with his policies, but grandpa is really nice, even though he wants to kill your babies and mutilate your children.
Can I respond to that? Okay.
Yeah.
I understand why people don't like either candidate. I get it.
Agreed.
All right. Mm-hmm. I can agree with that. I think Trump has said some horribly obnoxious, rude things, and probably done a lot of horribly obnoxious, rude things. But to be fair, Biden has done many of the same things. Biden's an angry old man. All right. And has done quite a bit to motivate the Justice Department, to weaponize the Justice Department against his political opponent. That's quite obvious. All right.
Yeah.
But with all that left aside, if you had Billy Graham running against Hitler, you'd still have two flawed candidates. Okay. But no Christian would say, oh, let's just vote for Hitler. We'd say, okay, let's go with the better guy. But if suppose you got two guys that you don't like, you need to remember, when it comes to the presidency, you're not voting for one person. You're voting for 5,000 people to go to Washington and implement an agenda that more than 75% of the time, the people that go to Washington are going to vote according to that agenda. So you're not voting for one person. You're voting for an entire block of policies that are going to be put into place. Would I love to have a guy who was morally upright and would put the right policies in? Of course I would. But if I can only have one or the other, I'm putting the policies in, because that's what you're sending the guy to Washington to do. Put in the right policies. No different than if you had a nice surgeon who wasn't a good surgeon and kind of a grumpy, bad bedside manner surgeon who was a great surgeon. Who would you pick for your brain surgery? Right?
Yeah.
You're going to pick the grumpy guy who's going to do the right surgery rather than the nice guy who's going to botch it. Right.
Yeah. No, that's well said. And I think it's important to think beyond it. I'm often surprised by the rationale, and I think this is part of the empathy cult or the misguided compassion in our culture that doesn't really think through the reality, especially from a Christian perspective, of the issues. They just go, well, that's really nice, and I have trouble with that too. And they're not thinking in a broader perspective. And so let's continue on with that as far as hierarchical issues. We talked about abortion. From your perspective, what would be another issue that would be a consideration?
The second biggest issue for me is religious freedom. And this is where pastors and other Christians who say, oh, I just preach the gospel, they're blind to the problem when they say that.
Yes.
Because I simply ask them this question: can you preach the gospel in North Korea? Can you preach the gospel in Tehran? Can you preach the gospel in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca? No, you can't. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. And if you don't think politics are important, you don't think the gospel's important, because politics affects our ability to preach and live the gospel. If you don't think so, go to some of the countries I've been to. I've been to Iran. I've been to Saudi Arabia. I've been to China. We can't do what we're doing on this podcast right now in those countries. Why? Because politically they ruled it out. You can't do what you do in your church every Sunday, Sam, in those countries. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. So if for no other reason Christians ought to be involved in politics, there are many, but this is one of them. You need to protect your ability to preach and live the gospel. Now, I always hear Christians say, well, you know, the gospel flourishes under persecution, as if that's an argument to allow persecution. No, it's not an argument to allow it. Sometimes it does flourish. Sometimes it doesn't. I don't think the gospel is very vibrant in North Korea right now. Right. So why would you wish that upon yourself anyway? And of course, the second part of this, as you mentioned earlier, is that we're commanded to love our neighbors. How do we love our neighbors from a political perspective? We put laws in place that protect them from evil. That's the number one purpose of government, is to protect innocent people from evil. You know, I'm reminded of the story of the church in Nazi Germany who just sung their hymns louder when the train of Jews came by on the way to Auschwitz. Why? They didn't do anything about it. They just didn't want to hear the cries of the Jews as they were on their way to the concentration camp. So they just sang their hymns louder. Is that what we're about in America? We're just going to sing our hymns louder while people are mutilating our children, while our borders open and they're bringing across drugs and bringing across kids that they're sex trafficking, and they're bringing across terrorists and weapons. We're just going to say that's okay. We're loving our neighbor. No, we're not. We're cowards when we don't get involved. We're supposed to be the conscience of the nation. If we don't speak up against those things, who is? Certainly not the leftists. They want that to happen.
Yeah, they do. Let's talk about that, you know, and religious freedom and exercising our right. We know there's a full-on attack about that, where it said, hey, you can have your religion, just keep it to yourself.
That's not our religion.
Just keep it in the church.
That's not our religion, to keep it to ourselves, to keep it in our church. We're supposed to live it, not just talk about it.
That's right. And that's what religious freedom really is. So let's jump into another issue that ChatGPT said was important to you. I'm teasing, but we would agree within that, and that's the issue that we're witnessing right now of immigration. We would both agree that a nation of immigrants, immigration is fine.
Good.
But immigration, as we are witnessing it in these, it's been a number of years, but especially under this current regime, if you would, just give a biblical perspective and a challenge to, because we're watching literally millions of people pour across our borders, and the response is, like I put this in one of my stories a few weeks ago, and somebody responded like, what do you have against immigrants? And I was just thinking to myself, like, how dumb are we that we can't even frame the problem, let alone have a discussion about solution? But give me your thoughts about that.
Well, I would ask, do you have a lock on your door? Oh, you do. Oh, you believe in borders then. What do you have against immigrants? What do you have against criminals? I don't have anything against them. I just think we have to have security and safety. Everybody believes in borders. The only question is, where should the border be? You don't just let anybody into your house, do you? You lock your door at night. Why? Because you believe in the depravity of man, that people are out there who might hurt you. And for no other reason, just for security, you have to have a border. You have to make sure that not the wrong people are coming in the nation. It's not compassionate to have an open border. Why? Because you're not just allowing good people to come across the border, you're allowing evil people to come across the border. You're allowing women and children to be trafficked. You're allowing drugs to come across the border. You might be allowing terrorists and weapons and drugs and all sorts of these things to come across the border. That's not compassion. That's stupidity. That's enablement of evil. Yes, we're for immigration, but it has to be done in an orderly way so we know who's coming in. We just can't allow this to continue. And it's quite obvious as to why it appears the left is allowing it to continue. They want this great country to be overrun with people that are going to vote Democrat. That's what it appears to be. So they can dole out more and more welfare to people who unfortunately are not going to contribute to society. Now, I'm not saying immigrants don't contribute to society. Most of them do. They do greatly. But why are we paying benefits to people who are not even citizens when some of our own citizens aren't getting these benefits, who are paying taxes? This is not the way forward. This doesn't help the immigrants because you're giving them something for nothing, which is not good. You're making them dependent. So this makes no sense. By the way, Jerusalem had a wall around it. Why? Why did Hezekiah build a wall? Why did Hezekiah build Hezekiah's tunnel? What? Because of security. You need security. And this is a biblical concept. It's a common sense concept. It's a concept we all agree with because everyone has a lock on their door. So the question is, where should it be? And for you to say, Sam, as a pastor, hey, let's talk about immigration, and someone says, what do you have against immigrants? That's just ignorant for them to say that. Let's have a conversation about it. Make your case as to why we should have no security.
Yeah.
I mean, should we have no security at the airport? Or just let anybody go on? I mean, come on. Wake up. Should we have no security in prisons? This is silly.
Yeah, it is silly. And part of that is, the degradation of society and the inability to think critically. And really consider and have wisdom and discernment related to the issues of the day. And so within these hierarchical issues that we need to think about in the context of, as believers, what we should support, how we should vote. There's two more things I want to bring up, and it could go different directions. But specifically, let's talk about the trans issue, the LGBTQ++, and what's happening with the mutilation of children. And I want to give a quick story, and then I'll let you speak to it for a while. But the party platforms differ in the promotion of, I would see, sexualizing children and being predatorial in this way. We see this, and we could go far with this, but I was recently at a gathering. It was a private conference for people that are pro-freedom, lawyers, lots of different people, and they were interviewing a young lady who there's a lawsuit on her behalf against her doctors and counselors because she had one counseling appointment. And at the end of that counseling appointment, during the counseling appointment, she said that she was struggling with her sexual identity. She might be in the wrong body. And they brought her parents in at the end of that counseling appointment and said, do you want a living son or a dead daughter? And after one appointment, they convinced that family and that child to go on puberty blockers. She has all kind of issues. Her body's been ravaged. And after all that was happening, a few years in, or I don't remember exactly how far along she was, she began to realize, you know what, I don't think that I'm supposed to be a boy. I just think I'm confused. And it went from celebration to termination. They had nothing to do with her. And now she's broken, confused. A wonderful organization of believers have come around to support, help, and encourage her. But these things are happening, and they're a pervasive evil, and they're being promoted and paid for by our government. And this is a biblical and political thing that we need to address. So there's lots of ways to take this, but go ahead and speak to it from your
As you look at their platforms, the Democrats are for it, the Republicans are against it, the transitioning of children. And rightfully so, we should be against it. I mean, let's just be real practical here, Sam. If you're daughter came to you and said she was a mermaid, would you take her off the coast and drop her in the ocean? No, you'd say,
No.
honey, your mind's playing tricks on you. You're not a mermaid. Or probably more common, suppose your daughter was anorexic. Would you say, honey, you're right, you're overweight, let me get you liposuction? No, you would say, honey, your mind's playing tricks on you. We need to get you counseling. We need to get you prayer. We need to get you medication if necessary. You're not overweight. You're dangerously underweight. But yet when it comes to sex, somehow, which is almost a perfect analogy to anorexia, this gender dysphoria, which, by the way, this rapid onset gender dysphoria is almost completely social media driven. There's been an explosion of this in the past decade or so. It's not, there's nothing new in the water. It's just people on social media who are already confused getting approval by doing this. This is not the way forward. It doesn't help people. It hurts people. Why you even have folks in the UK, gender clinics in the UK closing now because, and in Sweden and Scotland and other places, they're closing these clinics because they know how dangerous and harmful it is to young people to try and do this to them. While we here in America are skipping right toward oblivion by doing this to our children. In fact, I just updated a book called Correct, Not Politically Correct about same-sex marriage and transgenderism. And
Great book, by the way.
Yeah, we're not. I'm not putting Bible verses in there. This is a common sense medical case or common sense natural law case as to why transgenderism is not good for individuals and it's not good for a society. If you want to help people, you need to tell them the truth. You're not another gender. You can't be. There's only two genders. In fact, nature has pointed that out. You can either produce a sperm or an egg. There's no third category. And if you can't produce either, that's an incapacity, not a third capacity. By the way, the gender ideologues have to actually implicitly admit there's only two genders, despite the fact that they're saying there's an infinite number of genders. Why? Because if I'm a man and I think I'm a woman, Sam, I have to have some idea what a man is and some idea what a woman is to even know I have this mismatch between my psychology and my biology. If I didn't know what a man was or what a woman was, gender dysphoria wouldn't even be possible. I couldn't even know the difference. Secondly, if I try and make the so-called transition, which is impossible, you can't change your sex, it's impossible. But even if you were to try to do so, you have to have some idea what a man is and some idea what a woman is to make that so-called transition. Again, if there weren't such things as men and women, this whole thing would be impossible to even conceive of. So this is not a rational issue. It's a mental issue. It's a mental health issue. It's not fixed by surgery. You don't fix these problems through surgery. You fix these problems through psychiatry. And that's what we need to get back to. So it's not good for individuals. It's not good for a society. The Democrats are for it. In fact, Joe Biden himself, essentially on Trans Visibility Day on 2022, through his HHS, his Health and Human Services Department, put out a memo that basically said to parents, if you don't agree with your kid's gender identity, the government may come and take that child from you. I mean, this is barbaric and idiotic and harmful, and I can't see why people support it. They must not know the facts, because if you look at the facts,
you're not exaggerating that statement.
No,
you're not exaggerating that statement, because that's happening. Laws are being passed in various states. There's battles that are ongoing in relation to this, and it's one of those things that we need to look at this and say, you know what, children are special and precious to the Lord. You know, I was talking with someone after the last election. I said, did you realize that when President Biden was asked about whether or not children should be able to have sex reassignment surgery or be butchered, mutilated, would it be okay for an 8-year-old? That he said yes in the affirmative. Like, I would support that. I was like, we had the video of that. Like, do you not pay attention to that? So we know that there's lots of issues. We know there's things that we're going to agree or disagree, but there are hierarchical issues. Now, a leftist may say that, you know what, all that's fine, but the world's coming to an end. You know, we believe in ultimately the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, the return of Christ, regardless of your eschatology. The Lord's going to make all things new. He's going to rule and reign. The opposing view of that is, global warming. My eschatology says that global warming is going to happen, but at the hands of God, He's going to make all things new. There is what I would refer to a hysteria. In fact, I was looking for the quote real quick, and I couldn't find it. But I was reading. There's a gentleman that is calling for those who deny climate change they should ultimately be put to death. I think it was a professor in another country. I need to find the exact. Maybe I'll throw it in the show notes. That's how important
Thanos.
this is.
He's Thanos, right?
Yeah, because millions of people.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
thanks.
Exactly. Millions of people are going to die. We need to take this issue seriously. And I would say we do take this seriously in the sense of we are called to tend to the earth. We're called to be good stewards of what we've been given. There are issues of agreement where we can, as far as pollution and the upkeep of the world that's been entrusted to us, but that's not what climate change and what this mentality is all about. Some would say, well, this is the highest, most important issue, more than any of those other issues. How about you talk to those people for a few moments from your perspective?
Well, first of all, I think you're correct. Only the Christian worldview has justification for taking care of the environment. Secondly, I would also point out that even if the United States cut all of its carbon emissions to zero, that would not change climate change a bit if man-made carbon emissions are causing climate change. And there's even a debate about that. Okay.
Correct.
So the other thing you need to always keep in mind is there's always a cost to doing anything. If you put draconian carbon emission restrictions on the third world, more people are going to die from poverty and starvation than they are from any climate changing. So you always have to weigh these things out, even if their apocalyptic predictions are correct. The cure is worse than the disease. That's why these third world countries like India and China, of course, China's coming into more of a first world situation. They will not restrict their emissions because they need to feed people. That's more important than worrying about whether the temperature is going to rise by 0.5 degree in 50 years, right? They got people starving right now. So you always have to weigh the trade-offs. What is the cost of this? So for someone to come out and say, oh, you should die if you're not for my program. By the way, this is another ends in means issue. Okay. Even if the theory's true, the question is, how do we fix it? You can have different proposals on how to fix it. I can tell you one of the proposals that we ought not to be for is to kill a whole bunch of people through starvation by having draconian reductions. So, I mean, people think in such a non-connective way. They think this isolated issue can be dealt with without affecting other things. No, there's a ripple effect here. You try and do X over here, it's going to create Y over here. And people don't think in that way when they need to. They need to think of this thing as a big system rather than these isolated little issues that you can fix and not affect other things.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I think it's interconnected where we devalue human life and it's the worship of creation rather than the creator.
Sure.
And, when you think about this issue, you also need to pause and understand how words work and propaganda works. So when someone says you're a climate denier, it used to be global warming and all the models have been wrong. As long as I've been alive, now 50 years, I lived through acid rain, the ozone layer, has recovered, and, Florida, which I'm going to be flying to later this week, is not underwater. I'm going to go to the beach. It's still there after all these decades of warnings. And so they've been wrong over and over again. And so the terms have been changed to say that we're denying the climate or that climate change. Well, the climate's always changed and is changing. It's just a deceptive practice to try to get you to sign on to, in my opinion, taxation and control. But you can finish any final thoughts on that.
I've never had anybody answer this question. Why, long before there were human beings on the earth, were there ice ages and warm ages? When there were no carbon emissions from human beings.
Yeah.
Why? Because the climate's always changing. And whether we have anything to do with it, nudging it one way or the other is disputed. But it changes regardless of whether we're here and what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, but storms are worse, Dr. Frank, than we can remember for 100 years.
Yeah, than we can remember. By the way, fewer people now die in catastrophic storms than 100 years ago. Why? Because we have better technology, right? We can predict when they're coming. We can get people out. We have better buildings, better structures, better healthcare. I mean, come on.
Yeah. And the reason that there's more people, that there's more damage and billions of dollars is because we keep building in the path of storm lanes. I mean, we know the hurricanes are coming. We don't care. We're going to build on the beach.
You're right on the shore here. I step out the door. I'm in the ocean. Okay, there's a threat. Watch out. There's a cost to that.
So we've hit a lot of issues in this podcast, and I really appreciate your time. As we bring this together, people are listening to this. Maybe they agree with everything. They don't agree. Hopefully, you will just think. You'll think critically. If you're a Christian, you'll think critically and biblically. You are anyway, because you're borrowing from a Christian worldview to put the laws of logic in play and truth and so on. But just kind of a final thought as we get ready to head to a continual contentious election. It's important. The things that are going to be voted on, the worldviews that are going to be established and promoted and propagated throughout, not just our culture, but the world, because we push these things to the world. What would you say to the Christian and then the non-Christian that's considering as they head to the ballot box, not the battle box?
Yeah, right.
Sorry, a little shot at our... What would you say to them to bring this together?
As Jesus said, you need to vote the more important matters of the law. Don't neglect the more important matters of the law. More important matters of the law: life, religious freedom. Let's not mutilate our children. Let's make sure we have security. In fact, the number one really role of government is to protect innocent people from evil. That's Romans 13. That's why we have a government. In fact, one of the most pithy things ever said about government was said by the founder of our Constitution, James Madison, who said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Right? Why do we need a government? Because people do evil things. Why do we even need a secret service, by the way? Because people do evil things. Why do we need police, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force? Why? Because people do evil things. So we need a government that will protect innocent people from evil. When the government starts to do evil itself, like paying for abortions or prosecuting people unfairly or taking away religious freedom, which I'm just going to be honest, that's what the Democrats have been doing. We need to stand opposed to that. Okay. And by the way, I don't endorse candidates because candidates will let you down, but I will endorse policies because that's the issue. The policy. Make sure the policies that you're supporting are the major policies. You may find things you like in both platforms, but what's the most important? And as you look at the platforms, honestly, it's really hard to see how Christians can say the Democrat platform has Christian principles in it on the big issues. It doesn't. Yeah. In fact, John MacArthur basically said, if you read the Democrat platform, you're basically reading the sin list of Romans chapter 1.
Yeah.
And he's right.
He is.
So look, I'm just being honest here. I don't endorse candidates, but I will endorse platforms. I will endorse policy positions because that's what we're supposed to do as Christians. Let me say one other thing. Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Germany in World War II was trying to wake up the church that Hitler was going to do evil things. And he said there was a group in Germany that wanted to convert Hitler. In other words, they thought that was the solution. If we could get Hitler to become a Christian, that would solve all our problems. Well, yeah, maybe if you could, but that's impractical. And here's what Bonhoeffer said of this movement, the Oxford movement that was trying to convert Hitler. He said this: the Oxford movement was naive enough to try and convert Hitler, a ridiculous failure to recognize what is going on. We are the ones to be converted, not Hitler. In other words, he's saying we just need to do what's right and leave the results to God. We Christians have to rise up. We Christians have to love our neighbor enough to vote and to put the right policies in place. But when half the Christians, Sam, don't even vote, we're not loving our neighbor. In fact,
That's right.
If you're a Christian, a conservative Christian, you don't need to convince one leftist that you're correct. You don't need to convert one leftist to vote the right way. You just need to convince the half of the church that either is not voting or not voting biblically to do the right thing. If you convert the church, problem solved. But too many Christians are just complacent, or they're ignorant, or they're voting not at all, or they're voting the wrong way. Get informed.
Yeah.
And don't neglect the more important matters of the law, Matthew 23:23.
So good. Dr. Frank Turek, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Your ministry is crossexamined.org. You can find you on podcasts, on the radio, I believe, as well.
Yep. We're on the American Family Radio Network, but it's podcasted. So just look for the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. We do 2 a week.
Yeah, and they're fantastic. Highly encourage you to download that, keep that in your selections. And thanks so much again for sharing wisdom with us.
Thanks for the good work you're doing, Sam. God bless.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. I hope this message has inspired you to courageously stand up, speak up, and to live out your faith. If you like what you heard today, give me a 5-star review, follow the Courage Over Cowardice podcast, and share it with others to learn how to stand for truth in the midst of culture.